On today's Locked On Giants podcast, Ed Valentine of Big Blue View joins me as we take a look at where the Giants are, where they need to go, and how they're going to get there. That's coming up next on today's Locked On Giants podcast.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. Patricia Traynor here with you, and happy Friday to everybody. It's the last Friday of the Giants 2021 regular season. Thank God, right? That means we've got one more football game to go before the misery ends. And let me first thank everybody for making us your first listen of the day, or if you're watching us on YouTube, your first watch of the day. Appreciate you. And on today's show, we're going to get a jump start on talking about the future. And joining me to do that is good friend Ed Valentine of Big Blue View. And Ed, can you believe it? We're finally coming to the end of what has been a miserable and lost season. And I don't know about you, but I'm this close to feeling a sigh of relief.
Oh, I'm not even close to the sigh of relief, Patty. I'm there and beyond it already. So.
Oh my goodness, what a season it's been. I mean, it started off with so much promise and it just totally disintegrated. And, you know, Ed, let's talk about that. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk a little bit about, you know, where the season got off the rails. We'll talk a little bit about the future, what's might be coming up the next few weeks. Ed, I want to start with why the season got off the rails. Now, people will say injuries. People will say, you know, the offensive line and stuff like that. Let's talk about the injury issue. I mean, I know the Giants had an unusual amount of injuries, and it's not necessarily the number, but who the injuries are to. But that said, a lot of other teams around the NFL had injury issues and didn't have it go off the rails as badly as the Giants did. When you look back on this, though, I mean, what do you see as the biggest issue that knocked this season off course?
Well, Patty, I think we go all the way back to training camp. And yes, there are injuries, and the Giants lost Shane Lemieux and Nick Gates, you know, before the first quarter of the second game was over. They lost a lot of leadership along the way, with Blake Martinez going down and Jabril Peppers going down and Saquon missing a lot of games, and the last few games with Daniel Jones going down. But I just remember sitting there at the end of training camp, and I said again and again and again that the first three games of the season were the most important ones for the New York Giants. And I just remember feeling like the Giants came out of training camp, maybe partially because Kadarius Toney barely practiced and Saquon barely practiced and Kenny Golladay barely practiced, and we had no clue who the offensive linemen were going to be. But I felt like entering an incredibly important stretch in those first three games. I felt like the Giants entered the season not ready to compete. And I think their season was over after three games before it got a chance to really even get started.
Interesting, because, you know, you're right. There were a lot of injuries. And of course, you and I have talked about this many times about how Joe Judge, for whatever reason, waited until the last preseason game to basically put everybody on the field, as opposed to maybe seeing a little bit here, a little bit there, not realizing that, you know, injuries could strike and you might have to mix the starters with some of the backups. So you might want to take a look and see how those combinations look and get some chemistry between them.
Yeah, I just, like I said, Patty, I don't know what Joe's thinking was. I think that the thing that I have said multiple times is Joe came, you know, collegiately, he spent a great deal of time under Nick Saban at Alabama. In the NFL, he spent several years under Bill Belichick in New England. the Giants are not either one of those places where, I mean, in Alabama, you put the uniform on, you roll the ball out, and you're going to be better than 99% of the teams that you play. So you're going to win games no matter what. In New England, you always had Belichick and Brady. You're going to find a way to win games whether you're completely prepared or not. The Giants are not in that circumstance, and I'm not quite sure that Joe took that into account. But for whatever reason, I just felt like this team wasn't ready when the season started. We can talk about all the different personnel issues and all the problems with Jason Garrett and the other injuries that they've had, but I just thought they weren't ready to compete when the season began.
And that was shown to be true, especially on defense. When that unit started off and we were saying, gosh, what happened to the defense? Now, they ultimately found their way. The offense, not so much so, because injuries started piling up. And then, like you said, you had the problems with Jason Garrett and the offense, the problems that are still existing to this day. But, before we move on to the next topic, I want to ask you about the offensive line, because going into the preseason, going into training camp, the Giants were just steadfast that the offensive line wasn't going to be a problem, that it was going to be okay. And I remember asking Joe Judge when I got my one-on-one with him, I said, Joe, what gives you the reason to believe that this unit's going to be okay? You haven't really seen this unit. And this was the projected unit of Andrew Thomas, Shane Lemieux, Nick Gates, Will Hernandez at right guard, Matt Parrott at right tackle. So you had at least two new players at two different spots. So I said, what gives you the confidence that this unit is going to be okay when you haven't really seen them compete as a unit in a football game? And his response to me was, I like the way they work. I like how they're being taught, et cetera, et cetera. And I remember walking away and saying to myself, well, that's all well and good. But, to use an example here, Ed, I could hire one of your kids, all right, saying, I like the way you work, Ed. I know how you work, and I respect it. And so thinking that one of your children might be the same way. But we all know that's not, even though they come from the same background as you, it doesn't mean that they work the same as you. Do you know what I mean when I say that? So I just found that whole thing with the offensive line to be weird, didn't you?
I did. And that, Patty, that is Joe's stock answer and you know that, because he was asked about Mike Glennon the other day. He's been asked about Mike Glennon several times, and his answer is always, I like the way Mike works. I mean, he's not going to come out and say, Mike Glennon is a terrible NFL quarterback, and we made a mistake by counting on him to be the backup, which is absolutely the truth. He's a terrible NFL quarterback, and the Giants made a mistake by not taking the backup quarterback position seriously. But they're not going to come out and admit that. But that is one of Joe's stock answers is, I like the way the guy works. And I have a question, which I really should ask Joe Judge. And for me, this podcast, Paul Schwartz of the New York Post is not on this show, but I'm giving Paul Schwartz of the New York Post a shout out. I'm giving him kudos for having the guts this week to ask Joe Judge point blank if he thinks the New York Giants are a well-coached football team. Yeah. Because the answer point blank is that they're not. I'm sorry. They're not, especially on the offensive side of the ball. And I don't, and Joe is ultimately responsible for the guys he hired to coach that side of the ball. But, kudos to Paul for asking the question. And my question to Joe at this point, as an extension of that, has to be, look, you keep saying you love the way everybody works. Nobody in the locker room has quit. There's no golf clubs in the locker room. There's none of this and none of that, and everybody's giving you their maximum effort, and they're locked in and all of that. Well, if they're all locked in and they're all working that hard, why do they look like a ragtag semi-pro football team on Sunday afternoons? Why do they look like they haven't practiced in 2 months? Why do they look like they don't have a plan on offense and they're making it up, drawing it in the dirt in the fly? Why can't you why do they show pictures of the huddle on offense with 12 seconds to go on the play clock. And that's when you decide to run your subs in. For you're running 3 guys on the field with 10 seconds left on the clock and then trying to run to the line of scrimmage and get a play in. Why does this team look like it's completely dysfunctional if everybody's locked in and working hard?
Valid question, and one that does need to be asked. I think it's we've actually touched upon that in calls with Joe, and we don't get an answer because I don't know that he has an answer to it. And you're right.
And even if he does, he's not going to give you one.
Of course not. And you're right that he's a young head coach still, and he's still kind of feeling his way. But I pointed this out many times on my show and in my writings, that you are seeing a lot of the same mistakes being made now, late in the season, that should have been worked out in the beginning of the season when they were happening. The wasted timeouts, the questionable play calls, the sequences, how no play builds on top of one another. It's mind-boggling. And yet, according to Joe, it's like, you remember that scene from Animal House where I think, was it Niedermeyer or I forget who it was, where he's going, remain calm, all is well. No, it is not.
No, it's not. It's kind of beating a dead horse at this point, but I have said all year, starting, when Jason Garrett was offensive coordinator, it has never looked like the Giants had a coherent plan. They started out the season maybe trying to get the ball downfield a little bit. Then, the way I wrote it, the way I looked at it and wrote it today was Saquon got hurt, Andrew Thomas got hurt, and the Giants basically stopped trying to play offense. They basically just said, well, we're just going to hope that the offense doesn't screw up and turn the ball over, and maybe we'll win with defense and special teams. And that's about it. And anything and everything the Giants have done this year looks incoherent. It looks like it's throwing darts at the board. And for me, Sunday's game against the Bears was a perfect example. You talk about things not getting better. What did Joe tell us after the game? The game plan was run, and run some more. So what did they do? They came out on the very first play, went empty, and tried to throw without bothering to give Mike Glennon a check down option. And you wind up with a strip sack and you're behind by a touchdown 18 seconds into the game. Second possession, they get a 3rd and 2, which is a perfect rundown. You're at your own 45-yard line. Your game plan is run, and run some more. So run the ball. If you don't get it, go for it on 4th down and run it again. What does he do? He drops back, has Glennon throw the ball. He forces a pass to Kenny Golladay, and the game is over 7 minutes after it started. So your run game plan went out the window because you let Mike Glennon throw twice when you didn't have to, and you're behind by 2 touchdowns. I just don't get what they think they're doing.
All right, Giant fans, still more to come on today's Locked On Giants podcast. But first, if you made a New Year's resolution to eat healthier, then you will want to make Built Bar part of your plan. Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. It's covered in real milk chocolate, and it doesn't have that waxy or that chemical or that chalky taste that a lot of protein bars have. It's really good. It's available in nut and nut-free varieties. They have 9 amazing flavors plus a rotation of limited time flavors available for you to choose. And most Built Bars contain about 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Built Bar makes it easy to stick to your New Year's resolution to eat right without the guilt and without the calories. So head on over to BuiltBar.com and use our special promo code LOCK15 and you will save 15% off your first order. Again, that's code LOCKED15, LOCKED15 at BuiltBar.com for 15% off your first order. Ed, let's talk about a little bit the future now. Dave Gettleman will probably retire after the season ends. And I say will probably because we've got to hedge that there just in case, because you never know with this team when they might pull, when they might surprise you. But I think, 99.9% certain that Dave Gettleman will not be in the GM's chair next year. So that brings us to some questions as to what direction the Giants should go in regarding general manager if that chair does become empty. Now, earlier in this whole process, there were a couple of reports that Kevin Abrams was being considered, sort of like, I guess, on the basis of, okay, give Joe one more year, give Daniel one more year, let Kevin see if he can't fix this mess. And if the three of them fail, then sweep them all out and start all over and press the reset button. I don't know that I agree with that, if that is how they are thinking. What is your thought process regarding the direction they should go in with the general manager and subsequently with the head coach and with the quarterback?
Well, you have to start in the GM chair. And I think, Patty, probably when Dave Gettleman got the job, probably the Giants thought Dave can come in here and get this thing straightened out and at least make us relevant again and get us back on the right path. And then we can turn things over to Kevin because he's been a loyal soldier and he's been here for 2 decades and it's his turn. But when I look back and I like Dave, we've talked to Dave a bunch of times and I've never seen that side of Dave that people talk about, that some ex-players talk about, that side of Dave where they say he's uncaring and mean and all of those kinds of things. I've never seen that side of Dave personally. But when you think about Dave Gettleman's hiring, what did the Giants do? Giants ownership went into that process with a preconceived notion of what they wanted. They wanted a GM who they knew. They wanted someone with connections to the franchise. They wanted someone who would tell them what they wanted to hear, which was that Eli Manning could still be a winning quarterback in the NFL. Dave Gettleman had no other options. There wasn't another franchise in the NFL that was going to make him general manager at that point. So he got the job. The Giants barely conducted a search. What they have got to do this time, maybe they really want to keep Joe Judge. Maybe they really, really want to keep Daniel Jones. Maybe they'd really, really like to give the job to Kevin Abrams. But they have got to get out of their own way and get out of their own preconceived notions and wipe the slate clean and go out there and find the best candidate, whether that turns out to be Kevin Abrams, whether that turns out to be someone like Monty Ossenfort, who's got connections to Joe Judge, whether that turns out to be someone like Ed Dodds or whoever who has no connections to Judge, no connections to the franchise. Go out and find the best candidate and then let that person do his job. Don't tell that person you must keep Joe Judge. You let that person say, well, let's let this ride with Joe for a year and we'll see if we can make it work. If whoever that GM is wants to go out and make a trade for Russell Wilson, let him do that. If he wants to draft Kenny Pickett or Matt Corral in the first round, let him do that. I don't think that's the right move as far as drafting a quarterback in the top 10, but you hire the best GM you can hire, you get out of his way, and you let him try to fix this franchise, because whatever you've done for the last decade has obviously not worked.
So in other words, you go and you do a George Young 0.2, which is what I've been saying all along. You hire the best candidate, you let him do the job, and you stand back and you trust him to do the job the right way, which is what they did with George Young. But since then, really hasn't, that hasn't followed through with Ernie. It didn't follow through with Jerry. And I don't think it's really followed through with Dave if you look at the evidence behind each man's tenure. So I'm totally with you on that. So that said, though, I don't know that I would hire necessarily or limit my candidate pool to people who have worked before with Judge. And I kind of find it, a little odd that if they are going to keep Joe Judge, that he's going to have to, be involved in the interview process to make sure he can work with the guy. I mean, I like Joe as a person, but I don't think he's earned that right yet. Do you?
I don't think excuse me, Patty. I don't think he has either. And the problem that you're flirting with here is turning Joe into Bill O'Brien 2.0. And what the Houston Texans did was give Bill O'Brien carte blanche over the organization, decision-making power over everything when he hadn't earned it. He hadn't even proven that he was a good enough head coach to build a winning team, much less, be a GM. And Joe hasn't proven it either. I've said at Big Blue View, if Joe was a politician running for office, you would say that Joe is running a really bad campaign. Not to mention the fact that whoever his PR director is needs to tell him to shut up. But Joe's running a really bad campaign. He's not earning it. And I get the idea that if you're going to hire a GM, that you want the head coach and the GM to sit in a room and figure out if they can work together. You want them to be exposed, face to face to each other and to talk about their directions or their visions for the franchise. But this can't be Joe picking the GM, and it can't be the Giants picking a GM who will rubber stamp what Joe wants. This has to be a GM with the authority to say, the personnel decisions are mine. If I want this coach out of here, the coach is out of here. There has to be this can't be a rubber stamp for Joe. Joe just hasn't earned it yet. Everybody wants to kill, and I know I'm going on for a little while here, Patty. Everybody wants to kill Dave Gettleman for all of these personnel decisions the last 2 years. And justifiably so when you talk about the wrong decisions the Giants have made. But do not forget that Dave Gettleman's job is to give the coaching staff what it wants, and that the coaching staff, mostly Joe, has a lot of input into the people that get brought in, the people that get let go, the people that get passed over. So you can't just say that's all on Gettleman. That's also partially on Joe.
All right, Giant fans, we have more coming up on today's show. But first, college football championship is coming up. The NFL is wrapping up its season. The NBA and NHL are in full swing. And no matter what sport you follow, BetOnline has you covered all year long with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. Head on over to their new and updated desktop or mobile website at betonline.ag to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus with the promo code LOCKEDON. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers. Visit BetOnline today and get your 50% welcome bonus with the code LOCKEDON. Ed, moving forward, where did the Giants go from here? Obviously, GM is a big step they have to take, but coaching, should Joe be given another chance? And if so, what changes, other than obviously offensive coordinator, which I think we can all agree on, do you think he needs to make on his staff?
Patty, when push comes to shove, if this were 5-6 years ago and Joe Judge had replaced Tom Coughlin, and we hadn't gone through what we have gone through with Ben McAdoo and then Pat Shurmur, I would say you push Joe out the door because he just hasn't shown it. He's talked it. He won the press conference. He talked the talk. He sounds like he knows what he's doing. He sounds like he has a plan, but what we're seeing on the field is just not showing it. But I keep coming back to the idea that, first of all, he's still a young head coach. I think he's a very smart man. And you just get nowhere if you keep blowing things up every 2 years, because you're not just changing the head coach. You're changing the entire coaching staff. You're changing the type of players that you look for. You're getting the scouts who have been looking for a certain kind of player. Now you want something else. You're changing out the roster. Once again, you'll be changing out guys, maybe not because they deserve to be jettisoned, but we've both seen it, Patty. It happens too often that guys get jettisoned simply for the reason that the coaching staff wants their players. You know, the coaching staff wants Nate Ebner instead of Michael Thomas, like you previously mentioned. The coaching staff wants a bunch of former Arizona Cardinals on defense instead of the guys that you have. So you wind up jettisoning Devon Kennard, and you bring in Kareem Martin for 3 years and $15 million, which I'm sure he and his agent had a good laugh about, that they were able to get that kind of money from the Giants, because he's basically a practice squad player. But, those are the kinds of things that happen. You build nothing. At some point, you have to push your chips to the middle of the table and say, this is the path that we've chosen. We're going to ride it all the way to the end and see what happens. I think with that in mind, for me, you have to give Joe one more year. As long as whatever GM you hire comes in and says he's okay with that. Yeah. I think you have to give him one more year. And if it doesn't work, if they're a double-digit loss team again next year, if they still look dysfunctional on the sidelines, if they still look like they don't have a clue what they're doing on offense, then you've got to send Joe out the door.
Agree. All right. Final question for you, Ed. Quarterback. Now, we have talked about how maybe this draft class is not rich with a surefire, can't-miss prospect. So you bring back Daniel, assuming now Daniel Jones's neck is okay. You bring him back in 2022. But my opinion is you do not pick up that option year. Now, there was a time where I said, oh, it's a no-brainer, you got to pick it up. I would not pick it up given the injury issues and given the performance issues. I would say, okay, look, don't commit to that. Bring in an offensive coordinator, revamp that system, see how everybody does, and then worst case scenario, if you can't sign Daniel to a long-term extension, you franchise him. And that might mean, obviously, letting go of Saquon Barkley, but that's a whole other story for another time. How would you approach the quarterback situation?
Patty, I think you and I are in lockstep on that one. Before Daniel got hurt with this latest injury, I was in favor of not only bringing him back next year, I was in favor of, picking up that fifth-year option. But now when you see 3 injuries in 3 years, you're still not sure. I think he's at least an adequate quarterback. I really do. He's still, he can make all the throws. He can run a little bit. He's competitive. The Giants like his leadership, but you can't lead in a neck brace. You know what I mean? You can't lead in a neck brace. You can't lead, with jeans and a t-shirt on from the sideline. So I'm absolutely with you. I think barring the ability to trade for Russell Wilson, which I have said multiple times, I don't see as likely. I just don't see it. I don't see how the Giants can pull that off and without bankrupting their draft capital and without cutting a bunch of other players. Mm-hmm. You bring Daniel back next year, you more or less blow up this offensive staff, you get a better coordinator in here.
Better offensive line coaching, I think.
And for me, you streamline it. But here's the other thing, Patty. Joe brought in when he was hired, and I will be the first one to admit I liked the makeup. I liked the idea of what he did on his coaching staff. but this coaching staff needs real NFL assistant coaches on it, not coaches who have never been in the NFL, not coaches who have come from small colleges. This coaching staff needs people who have experience in the NFL game, who understand the NFL game, and who can teach the NFL game, not who come to the Giants to learn the NFL game, or because, I wanted the experience, once before before my coaching career is done, I wanted the experience of being in the NFL. This coaching staff needs real NFL coaches.
And not because they're Joe Judge's buddies or somebody he knew in his past history, which drives me crazy. But they've got to streamline it. And I know what Joe's intention was. And at the time I thought, okay, I get the logic behind it. But, you look at the end results and, okay, the talent on the offensive line was a big hole, no question. But, you would think they would be able to get something more out of it.
But if you're Patty, if you're a qualified NFL coach, after this much time of working with this group of people, you would have thought that you could identify a couple of things that you were capable of doing and lean into those things. Instead, every single week, they still look like they're just throwing darts at the wall and praying that somehow or another they make a good play.
Yeah, and they can't, for the life of them, they can't pick up a stunt all year long. But
that's because, Patty, every defensive coordinator in the NFL knows there's a number 71 on the Giants offensive line who doesn't know what that is. And all you have to do is run a stunt in front of that person, and your defensive end is in the quarterback's lap.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. So a lot of work for the Giants to be done this off season. It starts at the top. Get the GM settled, figure out what you're going to do with the coaching staff. If you keep Joe Judge, and if you do, what Joe's going to do to tweak his staff, and then the quarterback issue will be resolved, and just so much that is coming down the pipe. I mean, to an extent, Ed, I mean, it's almost as interesting, if not more interesting, I hate to say it, than the playoffs sometimes, because there's Patty, a lot of unknowns.
Just let me say this real quick. I was in a meeting the other day with some of the other SB Nation football editors, and it turned out that I was the only site editor in the meeting who did not have a team that was in the playoffs or still had a chance to be in the playoffs. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I don't need the playoffs. This is firing and hiring season. January's great for
traffic. We're used to this. We're experts.
Yeah, but it's great for traffic numbers. Hiring and firing is where it's at for you and me.
I know, and we become experts at it because it seems like we go through it every year.
I don't know how to cover the playoffs anymore, but I do know how to cover firings and hirings.
And it's funny because I have an opportunity to contribute to playoff coverage over at SI, and I'm like, I'm not sure if I remember how to do it. It's been so long, but but no, you're right. It's going to be an interesting off season, and I know you'll keep up with everything. I will keep up with everything. And Giant fans, strap in because it's going to be a wild, wild ride. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning into today's episode of the Locked On Giants podcast. Ed, thank you, as always, for coming on with me. Folks, thank you for making us your first listen of the day or your first watch of the day if you're on YouTube. We'll be back next week with, I guess, in essence, we'll start wrapping things up on an abysmal season, and we'll start looking ahead and start doing some more some different shows to get you ready for hiring season. So for Ed Valentine, I'm Patricia Traina. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.